Welcome back to another episode of Grizzly True Crime. My name is Gisela K, and today we're going to continue on with part 3 of analyzing the Moab Police Investigative report relating to the case of Gabby Petito and Brian Laundrie. So, let's get started. Thank you so much for tuning in today. If you are new here, then I hope that at some point during this video, you'll consider subscribing and becoming one of us, a Grizzly. And if you are already a Grizzly, then welcome back. It's always so nice to see you. Thank you for all your amazing comments. I love your comments. Please comment because you guys are not only keeping it Grizzly, which means keeping it classy, but you also offer some really valuable, intelligent feedback that I love so much. So be encouraged to leave your comments. Remember to hit the like button if you like this video. And as I say, subscribe if you're not yet. If you just want to peep in today, that's okay. We'll see you next time. So now today we continue on from page 40. Let's see how far we get. It's a 102-page document. And I like to chunk it a bit because if I make a 4-hour video, I just don't know if you'll watch that. Because I wouldn't. I'd be like, yeah, anything over an hour is like, better be good. So let's just see this next section, okay? So I'm going to make myself a bit smaller here so that we can see it nicely. And I'm going to read this to you, and we're going to go through it line by line, as we have with all 40 pages already. Moab City Police, other applicable sections. Wait. Coffee. Keep it Grizzly. Okay, 319, victim and witness assistance. 319.4, crime victims. Officers should provide all victims with the applicable victim information handouts. Sustained. The information has been previously addressed in the report. Yes, that they did not give them any handouts. No brochures. 321, standards of conduct. Laws, rules, and orders. Violation of federal, state, local, or administrative laws, rules, or regulations sustained. As previously described, I believe the officers responded to a domestic violence call and had probable cause an act of DV had been committed. This should have meant an arrest was made. This should have meant, yes, that an arrest was made either by citation or custody. This was a violation of Utah State Code 7736.2. Efficiency. A. Neglect of duty sustained. B. Unsatisfactory work performance, including but not limited to failure, incompetence, inefficiency, or delay in performing and or carrying out proper orders, work assignments, or the instructions of supervisors without a reasonable and bona fide excuse. Sustained. Cause for these determinations have already been addressed previously in the report. Performance. A. Failure to disclose or misrepresenting material facts or making any false or misleading statement on any application, examination form, or other official document. They say here, this applies to Officer Robbins' report and the information he put in the report which was inaccurate or misrepresented, which has already been detailed. Officer Robbins stated himself that he may be guilty of speculation when asked about some of the discrepancies. Yes, can we get a red flag for Officer Robbins on my word? E. Disparaging remarks or conduct concerning duly constituted authority to the extent that such conduct disrupts the efficiency of this department or subverts the good order, efficiency, and discipline of this department that would tend to discredit any of its members. Not sustained. This is in response to complaint number 5 from Tanya Reeves, where it is addressed in further detail. Any act on or off duty that brings discredit to this department, sustained. Cause for this determination has already been addressed previously in the report. 323. Report preparation. Report preparation. Employees should ensure that reports are sufficiently detailed for their purpose and free from errors prior to submission. It is the responsibility of the assigned employee to complete and submit all reports taken during the shift before going off duty unless permission to hold the report has been approved by a supervisor. Generally, reports requiring prompt follow-up action on active leads or arrest reports where the suspect remains in custody should not be held. All reports must accurately reflect the identity of the persons involved, all pertinent information seen, heard, or assimilated by any other sense, and any actions taken. Employees must not suppress, conceal, or distort the facts of any reported incident, nor shall any employee make a false report orally or in writing. Generally, the reporting employee's opinions should not be included in reports unless specifically identified as such. Sustained. I've already addressed the report writing concerns I had previously in this report. I don't believe the reports were sufficiently detailed as it related to this investigation. Okay. Report corrections. Supervisors must review reports for content and accuracy. If a correction is necessary, the reviewing supervisor should contact the authoring officer stating the reasons for rejections. The original report should be returned to the reporting employee for correction as soon as practical. It must be the responsibility of the originating officer to ensure that any report returned for correction is processed in a timely manner. Sustained. Although by the time the report would have made it to a supervisor, wouldn't have changed how the call was handled at the time, a supervisor reviewing the report should have addressed the concerns about the lack of arrest, the lack of details in the report, as well as the lack of follow-up with the reporting party. As part of addressing those concerns, the reporting party should have been contacted so their statement could have been documented as part of the report. Officer Robbins' report was reviewed and sent back for grammatical errors, but I am unaware of there being any content issues addressed by supervisors reviewing the reports. That is outside of Officer Pratt addressing the lack of Officer Robbins' following up with the original reporting party. Yes. Now, 342, Department's use of social media. 342.5, prohibited content. Content that is prohibited from posting includes, but is not limited to, any information that violates individual rights, including confidentiality and or privacy rights and those provided under state, federal, or local laws, and they say H here, personal information of an officer or the officer's immediate family member. Not sustained. This is in response to complaint number 1 from Tanya Reeves, which I provided a detailed response under that complaint. I think that was about his wife, when you saying that his wife also struggles with anxiety and takes medication and all that. Now, 422, portable audio or video recorders. Activation of the portable recorder. This policy is not intended to describe every possible situation in which the portable recorder should be used, although there are many situations where its use is appropriate. Members should activate the recorder anytime the member believes it would be appropriate or valuable to record an incident. The portable recorder shall be activated in any of the following situations: Utah Code 77A103, Utah Code 77A104. All enforcement and investigative contacts, including stops and field interview situations, and self-initiated activity in which a member would normally notify dispatch and dispatch calls for service. Sustained. So remember when that they didn't record any of the interactions with the witnesses, which is a bit odd. There were 2 identified contacts during this incident, both contacts with witness somebody, that were not recorded. The first contact by Officer Pratt was after officers were dispatched regarding this incident. The second contact was by Officer Robbins, who responded to that residence to collect a statement. According to this policy, the sections I noted above apply to this case. Explanations by both officers regarding the lack of video being activated for these contacts are explained previously in this report. 600. Investigation and prosecution. 603.1. Officer responsibilities. An officer responsible for an initial investigation shall complete no less than the following. A. Make a preliminary determination of whether a crime has been committed by completing, at minimum, 1. An initial statement from any witnesses or complainants. 2. A cursory examination for evidence. B. If information indicates a crime has occurred, the officer shall 4. Make reasonable attempts to locate, identify, and interview all available victims, complainants, witnesses, and suspects. And 6. Take any appropriate law enforcement action. Sustained. Cause for this determination has already been addressed previously in the report. Oh boy. Now we look at the conclusion on page 43. There is one thing I'd like to point out that I believe is applicable to this case as well as many DV cases. Just because Gabby was determined to be the predominant aggressor as it related to this incident doesn't mean she was the long-term predominant aggressor in this relationship. Good point. Oftentimes, in cases of DV, the long-term victim gets to a point emotionally where they defend themselves or act out in such a way where law enforcement is summoned. There have been many times in my career where someone who we know from past experience to be a long-term victim of DV gets arrested for committing an act of DV against their long-term abuser. Despite knowing the history of those involved, we have to make a decision based on the information presented to law enforcement at the time, despite our personal feelings and the known history of the relationship. That is complicated. It sounds like something that needs to be worked on, right? Because if you know of someone's long-term history or patterns of DV, and then the victim actually acts out, whoa, that is complicated. Because a lot of times, I've seen a lot of you in the comments also say, there's a lot of times that you've either experienced this or seen where the victim might suddenly say, you know what, no, I'm going to defend myself, and then they get arrested. Oh my word. It's very likely Gabby was a long-term victim of DV, whether that be physically, mentally, and or emotionally. Gabby had a job which she left in order to travel the country with Brian. Gabby was trying to start an online career which Brian didn't support or believe she could accomplish. Brian, it was 2021. Of course you can. Hello, welcome to the freaking modern world. Oh my word. Gabby was trying... Okay, hold on. Brian tried locking Gabby out of the van in an attempt to control her movements. Brian said he was trying to make Gabby calm down, and Gabby said she was trying to get Brian to stop telling her to calm down. Gabby also said Brian kept telling her to shut up. Based on the information provided, I can only assume the act of Brian grabbing Gabby's face was his attempt to make Gabby calm down or make her shut up. Although the act of grabbing someone's face, like in this case, rarely causes any significant injury, I find that the specific act of grabbing someone's face is extremely personal, violent, and controlling. Just because there may have been some signs that Brian was the long-term predominant aggressor, law enforcement could only act on the information they were provided. Officer Pratt said, we're doing all this with the fact in our mind that we know what happened later, so it's really convoluted and hard to tell you like anything other than what I thought at the time, which was if I missed a big red flag that he was a murderer, then yes, I missed it. If I would have known he was going to murder her, I would have taken vacation to follow them because I care about people, to the point where he was going to murder her, and I would have intervened and citizens arrested him in Wyoming. I would have taken my own time. I would have missed my family to go and do that. I'm desperately effed over that she got killed. I really am. I would have done anything to stop it if I would have known that it was coming. When speaking with Officer Pratt, I asked him if there was anything else that he thinks I should know or add as it related to this investigation. Officer Pratt said he accepts responsibility for anything that was found he did wrong in this case. Officer Pratt said, I accept responsibility for it, but I don't want anyone to think that I did not care. I have daughters, and I do want anyone involved to know that I talked to Gabby and I treated Gabby as much like I could fatherly, the way that I would want another cop to interact with my daughter, even if he got it wrong. I do care. I'm devastated about it. I cared that day and I still care. I don't think the public gets that I don't know if they know that we care. I don't know if they know. There's a lot of speculation regarding this incident, and I can't answer the what-if questions. There were mistakes made in how this case was handled. If this case was handled flawlessly, would it have changed anything? Nobody knows. More and more in law enforcement, perfection is what is being expected, and with that comes officers second-guessing themselves and their decisions. After reviewing all the information and speaking with the officers, I am confident and comfortable in stating the mistakes that were not made intentionally. The officers did not know what they were doing was wrong at the time and did not make the decision to benefit themselves in any way. They both believed at the time that they were making the right decision based on the totality of the circumstances that were presented. The Moab Police Department, and specifically Officer Pratt and Officer Robbins, are responsible for their actions or lack thereof as it pertains to this investigation. However, I find it difficult to assign responsibility to anyone other than the person or persons directly responsible for Gabby's death, weeks after and several hundred miles away from the August 12th incident in Moab. Based on my findings in this report, I would recommend at a minimum the following. Both officers be placed on probation, or, if they are still on probation, that probation be extended. A review of Officer Robbins's FTO program to determine if he needs to complete additional time on field training. Report writing training, at least 8 hours. The DV investigation relating training, at least 8 hours. Legal training. In addition to attending legal training to ensure officers understand Utah state laws and statutes, I would suggest building a stronger relationship with your local prosecutors to where if there are legal questions that officers are unable to answer, they are able to and feel comfortable with reaching out for additional guidance. A review of the report approval processes previously in place to determine if more checks and balances are needed. A follow-up with to obtain his statement. That's the other witness, regardless of how long it's been and whether or not his statement may be tainted due to the coverage of this case. A review of the software used to transfer files to reduce the risk of photographic evidence being lost in the future. Overall policy review. Update applicable policy sections to require photographs of injuries be taken of all those involved and require asking medical assistance to all those involved, regardless if they are a suspect or a victim. And implement a lethality assessment protocol and policy in all DV cases. Let me know what you think about what they've decided there. For me, I'm thinking the 8 hours thing is like a 1-day course. And I don't know how effective that's going to be. I'm not saying don't do it, but I'd be more like a 40-hour thing, at least a week. You know, you got to do some practicals and everything. I don't know. But let me know what you think. Exhibits. Okay, page 45, exhibits. Everything that I've used as part of this report or documented myself has been included with this report. All of this information will also be placed on a thumb drive, and the entirety of the contents of this investigation will be turned over to the Moab City Police Department. The Price City Police Department will not retain any of these records. Audio recording of the interview with Assistant Chief Palmer, Officer Pratt, and Officer Robbins. Body-worn camera notes taken by Brandon Ratcliffe. Body-worn camera recordings from Officer Pratt and Officer Robbins. Case Report 2021-001108. Written statement from that witness. Dispatch logs, dispatch 911 audio call and radio traffic. Emailed communication between Assistant Chief Palmer and Captain Brandon Ratcliffe. Formal complaint from Attorney Tanya Reeves. Grammar request form to obtain dispatch information. Moab Police Department policy, digital form only. Notes from interviews with Assistant Chief Palmer, Officer Pratt, and Officer Robbins taken by Brandon Ratcliffe. And signed Garrity Statement of Rights for Officer Pratt and Officer Robbins. Body-worn camera notes. Officer Eric Pratt, 2T8. Initial contact with Brian. Officer Pratt told Brian they got a call about a male hitting a female and then getting in the vehicle and taking off. Brian replies, I don't want to try and defend myself by saying anything here, but I pushed her away. She gets really worked up, and when she does, she swings, and unintelligible, something about hands, so I. Initial contact with Gabby. She said she's having a very stressed morning, says Brian is her fiancé, asked if he's a good guy, yeah. She said she was really stressed trying to get work done, said she was apologizing to him after she had thrown a bunch of stuff in the back of the van. She says she gets so stressed out and has OCD, says she sometimes has a mean attitude, but she's not trying to be mean about straightening things up. She said she was apologizing, but guess I said it in a mean tone. She said Brian got frustrated with her and locked her out of the van and told her to go and take a breather. She said she didn't want to. She said she wanted to get going and said they were out of water. She said their goal was to come here and refill the water. Asked what happened after he locked her out and told her to take a breather, she said he walked away to take his own breather, but she wanted to sit in the car because all her stuff was in the car. She said she had been working on something in the car, and that is where she wanted to be. So that's why I suspect that they weren't sitting in the coffee shop all day from 9 to 3. I'm thinking that they used the coffee shop's Wi-Fi and were probably sitting in the car. Brian told her to just relax for a second, but she didn't want to relax, so she got real mad. Oh, I can relate. No one must tell me to just relax if I'm a bit agitated. He asked what happened next, and she said she told him to drive to get water because she was really thirsty. He asks about a mark on her cheek and points out a mark on her left arm. He asked to see the other side of her face. He asked what happened. She said she wasn't sure what happened, stating it happened really fast. She said she was just trying to get back in the car and said his backpack was what got her. He tells her 2 people reported that Brian hit her, saw Brian punch her. She said, to be honest, I definitely hit him first. He asked where she hit Brian. She said she slapped him. He asked how many times, and she said a couple. She said he kept telling her to shut up. He asked what Brian's reaction was to that, and she said after a pause, grab my arm so I wouldn't slap him. He confirms Brian just grabbed her, and she said yeah. He asked, did he hit you though? He emphasized them needing the truth of what happened. She said, I guess, but I hit him first. As she's saying this, she's obviously becoming more physically emotional. He asked where Brian hit her. She said, while demonstrating that he grabbed my face, I guess. She then goes on to say that he didn't hit me in the face while demonstrating a punch to her other palm, like he didn't punch me in the face. She said again that he grabbed her by the face, demonstrating again, and says she can feel there's a cut on her left cheek, stating when she touches it, it burns. Officer Pratt asks if he had been drinking, and she replied stating that we don't drink. Officer Pratt asks what was with the driving as Officer Robbins saw the van hit the curb. She replied, I hit him. Officer Pratt says, while he was driving? She confirms she was hitting him while he was driving, but not a lot, but yeah. She said it was only for a second and said she saw the police car and she demonstrated throwing a punch. She said it was when she saw the lights on the police car, she hit him, demonstrating again by throwing a punch, and said, you're so stupid. Officer Pratt asks if she's okay and asks if she takes any medication for anxiety or anything. She said no. She said she just does yoga. She confirms she has a lot of anxiety and has OCD. Officer Pratt asks if Brian usually has a lot of patience with her. She said, yeah, but it just makes me upset. I know he definitely gets frustrated with me a lot because I have a lot of anxiety and he definitely has anxiety too. Officer Pratt relates to her and gives an example of his current relationship compared with his prior relationship and how if 2 people both have a lot of anxiety, they can feed off each other and things spiral. He tells her he's not trying to tell her how to live her life, but told her to look at the situation she's currently in. Can anyone relate to that? Because I sure can. I've been in that situation. Even with Mr. Grizzly, we both got anxiety, and I would highly recommend, number 1, therapy. Number 2, a psychiatrist. Yes, I've not been in a DV situation. However, I do know what it feels like when anxiety escalates, emotions escalate, and it's just a big mess. And I can honestly tell you, years later, therapy and medication help so much. Sometimes, and some will disagree with me, you cannot just do yoga or stretching to help with that. Mental health is a very serious thing that should be taken extremely seriously, and I believe that, I would say a blanket statement, all adults would benefit from therapy. We've all been through stuff, no matter how big or small it is. It is so helpful. And believe me, the past me would be looking at this me right now and saying, what? Because I was not a person. I was like, I was just so tough, I don't go to therapy. What the heck? But it is so life-changing. It's not an overnight thing or a little course or something. You got to go for a while. You got to go for at least a year or more. I would recommend. Anyway, okay, so second contact with Brian. Officer Pratt asked Brian if he wants to stand in the shade. Yeah, man, I can't help but giggle. I can't help it. It's because of that baldness, and he's sitting in the sun, and he's like, can I... the situation, can I sit in the shade because I'm bald? And then the officer says, I can offer you some shade, and he's the shade. He makes his shadow Brian's shade. That was quite something. He confirms they haven't been drinking, which Brian agreed. Officer Pratt said after talking to Gabby, initially they were worried about what kind of a guy Brian is, but now it's not so clear-cut. He points out the marks that were noticed on Brian's neck and said there were marks on Gabby's as well. Officer Pratt asked Brian to explain what happened Officer Pratt asked Brian to explain what happened to Officer Robbins, and he goes and looks into the cab of the van and walks back to where Brian is explaining what happened. He gets a drink from the female officer on the scene and takes it back to Gabby. Second contact with Gabby. Officer Pratt takes Gabby a Gatorade and asks if she prefers water. Gabby apologized and said she only drinks water, and he goes and grabs her water. He is met up by the female park ranger, who asks if Officer Pratt is concerned with the story. He said he wasn't. Said she seemed like a sweet girl with a lot of anxiety, and explained explains that from Gabby's story, she's the primary aggressor. The female park ranger confirms the circumstances explained by Brian also shows that Gabby is the primary aggressor. Officer Pratt said he would love to talk with the independent witnesses. He gives the water to Gabby and returns to Brian, who is still speaking with the officers. Third contact with Brian. He returns and is on his phone and appears to get the information from one of the independent witnesses and returns to his vehicle to make a phone call to witnesses. First contact with witness. The witness describes seeing them arguing a bit, and is something that caught his attention was they were possibly fighting over a phone. Believes it was her phone and he was trying to keep her from getting in her van. She said something like, "Why are you being so mean?" He got into the driver's seat and she was also trying to get in through the same door. She hit him a few times, more like play fighting, nothing like slugs to the face. He felt like something was off and had a weird vibe about it. She forced her way into the vehicle over his lap. They then drove away. He wasn't confident in the nature of the argument, said it was some sort of disagreement, wasn't sure why she went through the driver's door, thought that was strange. He noticed someone else was calling it in. Now 14:20 into the video. Officer Pratt asked if he ever saw the male strike the female. The witness was hesitant and said he maybe saw a push or shove, but nothing like a full-on punch at the face or anything. Officer Pratt asked if the shove was an aggressive action or a defensive maneuver. The witness wasn't sure, said it was a good question, and he wasn't entirely sure what was going on, but said it appeared to him that Brian was trying to close off the passenger side of the vehicle and close things up, put a backpack or something on the back of the vehicle, I'm not sure. Brian was stepping in, and she was out trying to get in. He said he didn't see anything that was him kicking after her or hitting her or vice versa. He said it was kind of light, and they were laughing, and he wasn't sure if they were just joking around, but it got more strange as he got into the vehicle and about to drive off. Officer Pratt said, "You did see her slapping him, it sounds like." He said, "Yes, my memory is he was in the driver's seat and had the driver door open, and she was like kind of hitting him near the arm, or maybe in the face with an open hand, and was saying to let her in." Officer Pratt thanks him for the independent story, which helped them figure out what was going on. Officer Pratt asked about a written statement, which the witness agrees to and states he would get it written down now before his memory fades. He reminded Officer Pratt he was just casually observing and something seemed off, and talked about it being a bad situation. Officer Pratt makes arrangements for a statement and hangs up the phone. Contact with Officer Robbins. Officer Pratt explains the story to Officer Robbins, stating the witness statement matches Gabby's statement to include he never saw him hit her, but saw him push her, but didn't know if it was in defense of what she was doing or as an aggressive action. Officer Pratt said she climbed over him to get into the vehicle as he was locked out. Officer Pratt explains that unless the male is claiming he is at fault, that the female is the primary aggressor in the situation. Officer Pratt explains that the law states in incidents of domestic violence that they shall arrest. Officer Pratt explains that doesn't necessarily mean someone needs to go to jail, stating they could release with a citation, with one of the stipulations being that they can ensure the safety of the victim. Officer Pratt states the problem with that is that they live in the same vehicle. Officer Pratt also points out the injury to Brian, victim. Officer Robbins' statement. Officer Robbins said he was getting conflicting stories on what happened when they hit the curb. Officer Robbins described what he first observed was the van crossed the double yellow line when the officer was going 42 miles per hour, and he was about 2 car lengths behind. Officer Robbins states he was tapping his whale, the siren, to get their attention and said they knew he was behind them. The van merged into the right lane and out of nowhere went right into the curb. Brian told Officer Robbins that Gabby grabbed the wheel and turned it real hard, where Gabby said she was hitting Brian in the arm. Officer Pratt states that the truth is usually somewhere in the middle, and Brian may be scared to say she hit him for fear of her going to jail, so it was easier to say she grabbed the wheel. I would say it's probably Brian trying to do like a car chase, get away from the cops, in my personal opinion. And that's why Brian's like, oh yeah, just saying whatever he can to say, I wasn't trying to get away from you. Officer Pratt tells Officer Robbins that they are going to have to charge her and states there could be a citation if there is an arrangement that could be made to separate them. Officer Pratt states they also need to explain to them that the no contact. They also need to explain to them the no contact order that would be in place, and also inform Brian how to waive the protective order at the Moab Police Department. Officer Pratt said they should go and speak with Brian first regarding what they needed to do. Fourth contact with Brian. Officer Pratt asks Officer Robbins about getting pictures. Officer Pratt then explains to Brian discretion when it comes to their job, and in Utah, they don't have discretion when it comes to DV cases. Officer Pratt brings up the independent witnesses who validated the story, and also brought up there being another witness who would likely also validate their story. Officer Pratt explains that even if Brian didn't want to pursue any charges, law enforcement doesn't have a choice. Officer Pratt talked about the challenges with the circumstances they lived together in a van, they're from Florida, and the difficulty in separating them. Officer Pratt explains they don't want to take her to jail because of her stature and his ability to defend himself, but again explains that they can't discriminate because she's the suspect and a female. They can't treat it any different than if it was the other way around. Officer Pratt asks Brian if he has any ideas on how to separate them, and asks if he has any friends in the area. Brian asks, "Can I go to jail?" Officer Pratt says, "No, because we don't have a charge for you." Brian points to Officer Robbins' waistband and joked about taking his radio. Officer Pratt explains to Brian that he could go to the police department during business hours and fill out a waiver to drop the no contact order so they can be together. Officer Pratt explains that Gabby will have a court date online, and from there it's up to the prosecutor. Brian said he didn't want to pursue anything, stating Gabby was his fiancée, he loves her, and it was a little squabble. I don't know if he said he loves her. He said we're a team. Anyway, Brian states that he wanted a checklist of things to do and wanted to get rid of this. Brian talks about wanting to get rid of it completely, and Officer Pratt explains the court process and the expectations of what may happen. Officer Pratt brings up again that officers had to follow the law, but the prosecutor could still potentially dismiss the case. Officer Pratt restates again that the first court appearance must happen, and Gabby would need to play ball with making sure she attends and talks about it being good for them, since they are traveling and could do it online. Brian said, "There we go, me and her are a team," and apologized again for the situation. Officer Pratt confirms there would be an online court date. Officer Pratt again explains that there will be a no contact order in place, and until Brian went into the police department to sign the waiver, the no contact order would be in place. Officer Pratt explains what a no contact order means and explains the process to waive it if he so chooses. Officer Pratt brings up the problem with what to do with her, stating they need to be able to separate them. They explain the option of having one of them getting a hotel room and staying separated until Brian can go to the police department the following day to fill out the waiver. Officer Pratt asks if Brian has friends in the area where one of them could stay, which Brian said they don't. Officers explain the charge, the difference in booking her into jail and just releasing her with a citation, and talk about the potential charge of violating the no contact order if she were to communicate with him before it's waived. Brian asks if Gabby can take the van and if they would be able to drop him off somewhere. Officers ask about her license, and Brian states she has one. Brian asks about being dropped off at Delicate Arch, and officers explain to him the problem with that would be him having to walk clear back into town to sign the waiver the next day, and having to do that before noon since everyone in the office leaves at noon on Fridays. They talk about, since Brian is determined to be the victim of a DV assault, that they had somewhere that would take him in to stay the night at no charge. Officer Pratt walks away and speaks with Gabby again after getting some water. Third contact with Gabby. Officer Pratt empathizes with Gabby, stating he was going to speak to her frankly, and states that he sees her like his own daughter, who he has similar in age. Officer Pratt also says he's going to speak to her not so much like a suspect but a victim who's dealing with a lot of issues in her personal life. Officer Pratt talks about the actions of both of them contributing to the circumstances, and stating the actions were due to her inability to cope with her anxiety and other issues she's having. Officer Pratt states Gabby's a victim of her issues and he felt like she would have done better in the situation if she possessed the skills to be able to handle it better, but was lacking those skills. That was at 31:27. Officer Pratt states that based on what she said, the witness said, and Brian, despite trying his hardest to keep her out of trouble, that Brian has marks on him that the witness state was caused by her actions towards him. Officer Pratt explains the fact they can't discriminate against him because she's a smaller female and he could easily defend himself against her. Officer Pratt goes into discretion and what is and isn't allowed under Utah law. Officer Pratt specifically talks about the law and how officers don't have discretion. All they can do is determine who the primary aggressor is, and that person must be charged. Officer Pratt explains to Gabby that they are trying to get Brian a room for the night and that she would be able to take the van to avoid her going to jail, further explaining that Gabby wouldn't qualify for a room since she is the primary aggressor and suspect in this instance. Officer Pratt explains to Gabby that she would be getting a citation and that she would have a court date and that she would need to attend online. Gabby becomes physically emotional and asks, "So I need to come back to Utah?" Officer Pratt explains that she would be able to attend the hearing online. Gabby asks if she can just get a ticket for something else. I believe she says for hitting the curb. Gabby's pleading with Officer Pratt, stating they are okay. Officer Pratt explains that if he could, he would just give them both warnings and tell them to stop hitting each other, but that they don't have discretion. Officer Pratt stated normally someone would be going to jail, but they are trying to work it out, that she could take the van and Brian would go elsewhere. Gabby asked if it was only because someone said they saw something. Officer Pratt told Gabby there were 2 witnesses, and one witness is confirmed to be consistent with what she said to happen, as well as Brian. Gabby is crying and says, "I don't want to be separated." Gabby continues to get more emotional, begging for a driving ticket, and that this is going to cause so much anxiety. Officer Pratt states that the best thing he could do is call his supervisor to see if he's missing something. Gabby is pleading, stating that she'll pay for any type of driving or parking ticket. Officer Pratt asked her to try and calm down, and he was going to call a supervisor. Officer Pratt reiterated he didn't think there was anything he'd be able to do, but he would see if a supervisor would tell him, or tell him something he may be missing. Gabby continued crying, stating she couldn't be alone and wouldn't be able to handle it. Separation anxiety, huh? Officer Pratt walks back to his vehicle, where he calls a supervisor. Contact with Supervisor Assistant Chief Braden Palmer. Officer Pratt tells Assistant Chief Palmer that a tiny little 22-year-old girl slapped her fiancé multiple times, and he has a mark on his jaw. Officer Pratt says the one witness statement was consistent with Gabby's statement as well as Brian's statement. Officer Pratt tells the story of Gabby getting pissed off. He's trying to separate from her. She's not staying away from him. There are severe anxiety problems. He locks her out of the van, telling her to go for a walk and cool off. She forced her way into the van, clawing her way past him to be with him. He's shoving her to try and keep her out of the van. She's punching, slapping, everything. She's 105 pounds, soaking wet, 22 years old, full of anxiety, having a real tough time. Not making excuses, it's written in the code. We have a domestic assault here. He's not wanting to pursue it, very adamant against pursuing it. We don't have discretion on these things. Give them a no contact. See if the safe haven place can give a room. Leave her with the van so we don't need to put her in jail. She's really struggling with not being alone. She's really struggling with not being alone without him, and they want to be together. I told her that's not anything I can do. This is all written in statute. I said the last thing I can do is call a supervisor, where this is such a minor. This was like a slap fight and injuries from like a fingernail. I just don't know if it's worth the whole domestic thing or not. Okay. If it's going to get us in trouble, and if we don't do it this way, supervisor talking can't hear. Well, they don't want to, but unless I can get some kind of permission, some other way, we have to separate. Yeah, supervisor talking can't hear. As far as the domestic assault charge, what do you think about that? Supervisor talking can't hear. Well, I mean, supervisor talking can't hear. Do the whole thing or not? He cut himself off. Supervisor talking can't hear. But is there a way of not doing something like this? I mean, it's so minor. It's hard to say, right? I'm going to reread the statute and just see if it fits or if there's a way it doesn't fit, and if I can find a way that it, because it really is, the spirit of the law is being lost on this one. It really is. So let me see what I can find, and if nothing else, then we'll have to separate them, whether she likes it or not. All right, thanks, bye. Ooh. Oh, okay, looking up the code. Second conversation with Officer Robbins. Officer Pratt looks up code and says, bodily injury means physical pain, illness, or any impairment of physical condition. So let's see. He's not ill. He doesn't have any impairment of physical condition. And if he's not in pain, he asks Officer Robbins, how far do you want to go with this? You know why the domestic assault code is there? It's there to protect people. The reason why they don't give us discretion in these things is that too many times women who are at risk go back to their abuser, just wanted him to stop and don't want to have to be separated, don't want him charged, don't want him to go to jail, and the treatment gets worse and worse and they end up being killed. That's a hectic statement in hindsight. In no way, shape or form that I can perceive does what happened here, a little slap fight between fiancés who love each other and want to be together, can I perceive that this is going to digress into the situation where he is going to be a battered man. But then again, I don't have a crystal ball. Yeah, wrong victim, huh? He goes on to say he talked with the assistant chief to see if there's any way to go less than the full force domestic assault route, and he says, look, either go all the way or don't. Officer Pratt said he asks, under what circumstances can I not? The only time I cannot is if it doesn't fit. If it fits, then it's in the law and you have to do it. Officer Pratt explains he went and looked at the code for assault. Officer Pratt talks about how they both know what assault is, but talks about how valuable it is to look it up and read it word for word. Officer Pratt then reads the statute for assault. They start talking about the specific verbiage in the code, specifically about it meaning the intent to do bodily harm or bodily injury. Officer Pratt then looked up the definition of bodily injury in Utah code and reads it again, which he did previously. Officer Robbins points out that Brian had a swollen right eye. Okay, now it's a swollen right eye. Officer Pratt tells Officer Robbins that the result didn't matter. It was about the intent and if she intended to cause him pain, illness, or impairment of physical condition. Officer Robbins asks if the definition included attempt and intent or attempt or intent. Officer Pratt replies stating, when you're attempting to do something, you have to intend to do it. Officer Pratt insinuates that intent is synonymous with attempt. Officer Pratt asks Officer Robbins, what was her intent? Officer Pratt tells Officer Robbins to speak with Gabby and ask her questions regarding the intent behind her actions, stating that whatever Gabby answers will seal her fate. The officers then go to Gabby to speak with her further. Fourth contact with Gabby. Officer Pratt tells Gabby he has a question for her, and how she answered the question determined what happened next, and further stating that she was the only one that could answer the question. Officer Pratt continues to tell her, think very hard before you answer the question. Officer Pratt asks Gabby, when you slapped him those times, were you attempting to cause him physical pain or physical impairment? Gabby answers immediately, shaking her head side to side and stating, no. Officer Pratt asks Gabby, what were you attempting to do? What was the reason behind the slapping and stuff? What were you attempting to accomplish by slapping him? Gabby replies, I was trying to get him to stop telling me to calm down. Officer Pratt then says out loud, well, it doesn't sound to me like she attempted to injure him. Officer Pratt then tells Officer Robbins, it's your call, it's 100% your call. I support you either way. Officer Pratt then walks away where Officer Robbins approaches him a moment later and is also joined by the female park ranger. Officer Robbins states he doesn't entirely believe her. Officer Robbins goes on to explain that Gabby admitted to striking Brian in the arm earlier, which Brian also acknowledged. The female park ranger confirms that what she was told by Gabby was that Brian was looking at Gabby when Gabby struck him, which was the reason why there were marks on Brian's face that was closest to his window. The female park ranger said Gabby told her she wasn't trying to hurt Brian, but that Brian just wasn't listening to her, and it was her fault Brian hit the curb because she was distracting him. 47:15. That Officer Robbins, man, it's like he's out to get Gabby a little bit. I don't know. Sorry for saying that, but I'm just like, ooh. Anyway, Officer Pratt goes on to explain what assault is, defined in the code book, and again brings up what the code states bodily injury means. Officer Pratt reminds the others he's recording and states society, judges, everyone can judge them for this. And they did, oh my word. Officer Pratt states he's looking at a 110-pound female with her fiancé, and they have no means to be separated. Officer Pratt states Brian doesn't want to pursue it. She's not a threat to him more than the slight abrasions from her fingernails. Officer Pratt states he doesn't care if they use the actual letter of the law to not charge. I also don't care, it literally makes perfect sense to go full-on domestic assault. Officer Pratt tells Officer Robbins it is his decision and states he would support him either way. Officer Robbins states he's going to do a crime report on it, won't charge right now, send it off to the city attorney and let them screen it for charges. Officer Pratt tells him that if he does that and they strongly disagree with his decision, that they throw a complete fit. You might hear about it in a very negative way. Officer Pratt then suggests Officer Robbins to make a decision yourself. The female park ranger states she would rather be dinged for a decision I made than a decision I didn't make. Officer Pratt states, especially if they think you were completely negligent in your decision. Officer Pratt tells Officer Robbins that he completely supports him in whatever decision he makes, even if they go as far as taking her to jail. At this point, a call is coming through and Officer Pratt states he better take this. Officer Robbins states he'll make the decision and states he's going to cite and go through the process. Officer Pratt asks him if he feels more comfortable taking the other call. Officer Robbins is hesitant either way and states it's basically 50-50. Officer Pratt tells Officer Robbins that he could also separate them for the night and take no action. Officer Pratt tells Officer Robbins that if they find each other again, he's still separated them and provided for Brian's safety. Officer Pratt tells him that if they find each other again, then it's on him. The female park ranger states, you can't babysit them all night. Officer Pratt tells Officer Robbins he could separate them and tell them to let it cool off until tomorrow. If they don't let it cool off and we hear about it, we'll hear about it. Officer Pratt says if there is continued fighting going on, you already were Mr. Nice Guy, you already gave them a chance. What you can't do by law is separate someone and say, if we hear from you again, we're going to arrest one of you. Stating that if any one of them really needed help, they may not call the police and you can't threaten them with that. Officer Pratt continues telling Officer Robbins to go full or nothing or somewhere in between and separate them, stating and kind of give them a nod. The wink like, hey, stay separated, it's up to you. Officer Pratt then tells Officer Robbins he's going to handle the call that just came in. Officer Pratt tells Officer Robbins that he has very capable help with him and that he trusts him. Officer Pratt tells Officer Robbins to call if he has any problems. He gets in his vehicle, clears the call, and states he's en route to the intoxicated male call. Officer Daniel Scott Robbins, T29. The video starts with the officer stating that the driver of the van was showing some obscure driving and possibly intoxicated. Stated he was going about 45 miles an hour and the speed limit in the area was 25 miles per hour. He then reported the van just hit the curb and stated the speed limit was actually 15 miles per hour. Yes, 3 times the speed he was going. Initial contact with both occupants. He asked Brian to place the van into park and set the keys on the dash. He asked for their names and asked Gabby why she was crying. Gabby states they've been fighting this morning, stating there have been personal issues. Brian states it's been a long day and stated they were camping yesterday and apologized for hitting the curb. Gabby states, I was distracting him from driving, I'm sorry. He asked Gabby to step out of the van and asked Brian if he can set the keys on the hood of the car. Brian provides the keys to the officer. Initial contact alone with Gabby. He notifies dispatch he has the female separated from the male. He asks Gabby what happened. Gabby's crying and states she has really bad OCD, was straightening up the van and apologizing to Brian for being so mean because sometimes she has OCD and sometimes she gets really frustrated. She stated she was apologizing to Brian for being in a bad mood. Gabby stated she had so much work she was doing on her computer this morning and the officer asked what she does for work. Gabby states she used to work at an organic juice bar as a nutritionist, but quit her job to travel across the country and is trying to start a blog. She said she has been building her website and has been really stressed and stated that Brian doesn't really believe that she can do any of it and that was upsetting. Gabby states they've been fighting all morning and Brian wouldn't let her in the car before. Officer Robbins asked why he wouldn't let her in the van. Gabby said Brian told her she needed to calm down. Gabby goes on to say she's perfectly calm all the time and states Brian really stresses her out and said this has just been a rough morning. Officer Robbins tells Gabby that he's going to place her in the back of his car, stating that at this time she isn't in any trouble and isn't going to be in handcuffs. He tells her she will have air conditioning and allow her time to take a breath and relax a little, and then he will return later on and talk to her. He then puts her in his patrol car and returns to the van. Initial contact alone with Brian, assisted by male park ranger. Brian asks if he was just talking with his fiancée, which he confirms. Officer Robbins asks Brian to step out of the van so they can talk. Officer Robbins asks Brian what was going on. Brian states that Gabby gets really worked up sometimes and he tries to distance himself from her. Brian stated he locked the car and walked away from her. Brian continues, stated that what happened this morning was Gabby was trying to start up her own website or blog and said he gave her time, but then she started saying that they had a nice morning. Brian stated that she got worked up as they were trying to get their day going and go to the Archers. Yeah, I think that would be Brian getting worked up because all he wants to do is go to the Archers. He doesn't want responsibilities or blogs or websites or any kind of income stream. No, he wants to go to the Archers, man, with his melons. Officer Robbins asked Brian to tell him about the scratches that are on his face. Brian replies, she had her cell phone in her hand, and that's why I was pushing her away. Brian talks about locking the van and walking away and suggesting they take a breather. Brian stated that was the only way to calm down from it and stated Gabby was getting worked up. Brian said Gabby had her phone and was trying to get the keys and that it is when he was pushing her away. Brian said he knew he shouldn't push her, but stated he was just trying to push her away, stating again that they needed to take a minute and step back and breathe. And then he pointed to the area near his right eye and said, she got me with her phone. Officer Robbins asked to look at Brian's hand and points out a scratch on his left hand. Brian states, that's from a wire. Why did they not ask him where, what, how? Anyway, Officer Robbins asked Brian about hitting the curb. Brian states, while demonstrating, that hitting the curb was from Gabby grabbing and turning the wheel. Brian said Gabby said, I can't believe we're getting pulled over, and grabbed the wheel. Officer Robbins asked about his speed and Brian states he knew he was going fast and said it was probably from the adrenaline of getting pulled over and Gabby grabbing the wheel and said he was still shaken up. Brian said if he sped up then he was sorry about that. Brian added if he was speeding beforehand he was also sorry about that. Officer Robbins stated it took him a little bit to catch up and Brian apologized again, stating he was headed into the park to get water, stating they have a 6-gallon water container to fill up for the upcoming hike. Brian continued stating he was trying to keep everything calm and quiet because there was still plenty of time to go for the hike. Officer Robbins asks Brian to sit on the curb after ensuring there were no weapons on him. Officer Robbins asked Brian for his ID, to which he said it was in the van. Officer Robbins said that it was okay and then collected his name and date of birth. He then runs the information through dispatch. Officer Robbins then goes and stands next to Officer Pratt, who is still interviewing Gabby. The interaction while standing with Officer Pratt is already documented. 11:35. Officer Pratt walks away to speak with Brian and Officer Robbins continues the interview with Gabby. Officer Robbins states he heard Gabby say she was hitting Brian in the arm while they were driving. Officer Robbins asked Gabby if she grabbed the steering wheel at all. Gabby stated she did not touch the steering wheel but only for like a second. I just saw the lights come on. And demonstrated the punch she did to Brian while stating, you're an idiot. Officer Robbins asked again if she grabbed the steering wheel at all, and she shook her head side to side while stating, no, I didn't touch the steering wheel at all. Officer Robbins states he's going to shut the door and ask Gabby if she had enough air or if she needed him to turn it up. Gabby asks Officer Robbins for water. Officer Robbins walks away, asks the female park ranger if she has any water, then walks over to Brian, who is speaking with Officer Pratt and the male park ranger. Second interaction with Brian. Officer Robbins asked Brian to start at the beginning and tell him again what happened. Brian stated they have been inaudible for the last week or so and stated that the flies have been pretty intense and stated the flies have definitely been getting to her. Further stating that his feet are also dirty. He stated their little squabble started while they were hanging out at the coffee shop, and when they got back to the van, there was some little dirt at the back of the van. Brian stated he moved their food around, and, interrupted by the female officer taking a drink to Gabby, they asked Brian if he needed water. Brian stated he didn't like plastic bottles. He continued with the story. Brian stated there was a little disagreement there. He continues stating this was at the beginning, and added again that Gabby was getting a little worked up. Officer Robbins asks what the disagreement was about. Brian then stated he wouldn't even call it a disagreement, but stated again he had dirty feet and stated they were at the coffee shop for so long, stating that they were there from about 9 to 3, and stated that it was a few little things adding. They were relationship things, and stated to Officer Robbins that he didn't know if Officer Robbins was in a relationship, but again stated it was just little relationship things. Brian continues stating they weren't physical before the point Brian said to let's just take a breather, and stated he would lock the van up and they would each go for a walk about a block in different directions and then come back to the van. Lies, because he locked himself in the van. He was going to take the van by himself. He was trying to get her phone and her van. Brian stated she was worked up and had her phone in her hand as well as her keys, then added it wasn't the keys, it was her phone and the rings that were on her fingers. Brian stated he had the keys because he didn't want her to go anywhere. Okay, so Brian says she had her phone and her keys in her hand and then all those rings. But then the next minute he says that he had the keys because he didn't want her to go anywhere. Okay, Brian, who had the keys? Was it her or you? I think it was you. He said he didn't have his phone, then said he doesn't really have a phone, and was worried about her leaving without him. Then he would be left on his own. One of you Grizzlies made a very good point, saying when he says he doesn't really have a phone, it could be like he doesn't have a contract with a provider, he doesn't really use the phone to call or do anything like that, that maybe it's sort of like a burner phone, you know what I mean? Just the phone to connect to Wi-Fi at all these different places if he needs to. Brian continued stating that he said, let's just go for a walk, and stated Gabby was trying to get the keys from him. See, he had the keys. And that is when he demonstrated pushing her away and stating that is when she hit me. Brian stated he didn't really get physical, but stated he was just trying to push her away and not get hit. Brian said this is when he got really loud, and stated that is probably when they drew everyone's attention. What was when he was yelling, back up, get away, just give me a... Well, Officer Robbins asked about the scratches near his eye and asked what caused that. Brian stated it was the phone. Officer Robbins tried clarifying by stating that Brian pushed her and then she hit him. Brian corrected him and said Gabby had already jumped on him and was swinging when he pushed her, and added that she had a lot of rings and nails which would have caused the injuries. Okay, he's got the same amount of nails as you, dude. Okay, she's got 10 nails. So do you. My word. The male park ranger points out that there are scratches on the left side of his neck, on the left side of his nose, a scratch near the center of his face, and a bruise and bleeding on the right side of his head. Officer Robbins then asks Brian to pull up his right sleeve and notices further injury near his right bicep or tricep. Officer Robbins asks what the injury is from, and Brian stated, I suppose fingernails, but I'm not complaining. Officer Robbins asks if it's bruised or tender, and Brian states no, and continues by stating, I'm fine, and I love Gabby. I hope she doesn't have too many complaints about me. Okay. While pointing towards the direction she's at. Brian added that he felt bad about getting so loud, and stated he was just trying to get some distance. He said, I was trying to make her calm down, and said he pointed out to her that everyone's watching. Officer Robbins then leaves to go talk with Officer Pratt, but he's busy and returns to Brian and said he has some more questions. Officer Robbins asked Brian if he takes any medications. Brian stated he doesn't, but said Gabby has told him in the past that he should take Xanax or something like that because he has high anxiety. Officer Robbins asks if he's normally hyper. Brian asks if he seems like he is. Brian stated his heart rate jumped when he saw the lights. The male park ranger asks, and Officer Robbins asks, if Gabby takes any medications that he's aware of. Brian replies while laughing, she's just crazy. Then immediately dismisses it and says he was just kidding. Brian stated Gabby doesn't take any medication he was aware of. Officer Robbins leaves with Brian and walks back to Gabby. We're going to go up to page 60 today, okay? Second contact with Gabby. Officer Robbins asks Gabby for her personal information and runs her through dispatch. He misspells her last name and walks back to where Brian is. Third contact with Brian. While he's waiting to hear back from dispatch, there is small talk with Brian and the male park ranger about irrelevant stuff that isn't worth documenting. Officer Pratt, oh, is it? I would like it documented, please. Can we know what that small talk was, Officer Pratt returns to Officer Robbins and states he just spoke to a witness, and they go off together to discuss what the witness stated. Conversation between officers. This information is already documented from the prior video observations, 2054. After speaking together, they both walk over to Brian and continue talking with him together, which is already documented. They are there together until 33:15 when Officer Robbins makes a phone call to try and get arrangements for Brian to have somewhere to stay. Phone call. Officer Robbins makes the phone call and returns to Brian and Officer Pratt. Fourth contact with Brian. Officer Robbins returns to Brian while Officer Pratt is now speaking with Gabby. He tells Brian that they are making arrangements for him to have a place to stay, and Brian is obviously physically emotional about it and thankful for their help. Physically emotional about it? You mean overjoyed? Officer Robbins starts empathizing with Brian and brings up his own relationship and the anxiety between him and his wife. Brian adds that sometimes he just has to walk away. Officer Robbins states he isn't going to try and give him life advice, as Brian has been on this earth almost as long as he has. Oh dear. Oh man. Officer Robbins apologizes for everything that has happened to Brian and Gabby and Brian. Brian is thankful and asks if he can make himself a little bag of stuff if they are going to be taking him somewhere. The male park ranger assists Brian with this, while Officer Robbins returns to Officer Pratt and the female park ranger. This information is already documented. They are together until 36:27 when he gets a phone call. Second phone call. The phone call is with the person that they are using to help get a room for Brian. He provides the person Brian's information and a brief synopsis of what had occurred. He's on the phone and advises she will be getting charged with domestic assault and a protective order will be temporarily in place. He's on the phone call for a few minutes and then returns to the van to speak with Brian. Fifth contact with Brian. He explains that since he's a victim in this case, he asked about taking photographs of the injuries that Brian sustained from the incident. The officer's taking photographs when the female park ranger walks up and asks about getting Gabby's cell phone. Brian gets the cell phone for the park ranger and then returns where more photographs are taken. He takes pictures of his face, his arm, hands, and neck. He then asks Brian to lift his shirt up so he can see if there are any further injuries. When he lifts his shirt up, it looks like there's a long red scratch or scar underneath his left pec, but the officer doesn't take a picture of it. I did not see that. Did you see that? I slowed it down, I zoomed in, I did whatever I could. I could not see that long red scratch, but okay. He explains to Brian he's still working on getting Brian a place to stay, and it will be a bit longer before they can secure that. He explains that they will still have a few minutes that they need to cite Gabby and provide her with the information that she'll need. He leaves Brian to the male park ranger and then walks back and makes contact with the female park ranger. The female park ranger stated the female was calling her parents to try and feel better. She said that Gabby doesn't want to have to spend a night without Brian and was struggling. The officer stated that she didn't have a choice in the matter, and the female park ranger agreed and said the other officer went to call a supervisor. Officer Robbins returns to the vehicle where Officer Pratt is, where they have a conversation about the code verbiage, and this information is already documented in the notes above. Conversation between two officers, they speak until 48:46 and go back to Gabby. Third contact with Gabby. They return and speak with Gabby, and this information is already documented in the notes above. They are there until Officer Pratt leaves for another call at 54:34. Sixth contact with Brian. Officer Robbins gets a picture of his driver's license and collects his phone number. Brian shows the officer his phone that has the number. Interesting, whereas before he stated he didn't really have a phone. Officer Robbins leaves and returns to Gabby. Fourth contact with Gabby. He collects Gabby's phone number and asks for her ID, which is still in the van. Gabby tells Officer Robbins where it is at, and the female park ranger walks towards the van. Officer Robbins tells Gabby he has decided not to cite Gabby for domestic violence assault and that she isn't getting charged with anything. Officer Robbins tells Gabby that he does have to separate them tonight and wants them away from each other where they can relax. Officer Robbins tells her that she'll be taking the van and that Brian is getting lined up with a hotel room. He tells them to stay away from each other. He said he wants them to have a chance to get away from each other, breathe, talk to their parents, etc. Female park ranger returns and Officer Robbins gets a picture of her ID. At 58:19, he gets a phone call and walks away. Third phone call. The phone call doesn't last long, and it sounded like there was a place across from 7-Eleven that was mentioned. Bowen's? Yeah, the Bowen Motel. Fifth contact with Gabby. He returns and again tells Gabby that Brian has a hotel room for the night. He tells Gabby he has to keep them separated, but states he can pass a message to him if she would like. He asks if Gabby wants him to tell Brian she loves him and she'll see him tomorrow. Gabby agrees. Did she though? It was kind of like, yeah, okay. Gabby agrees and tells Officer Robbins to tell Brian not to forget a phone charger. Yeah, that's what she wanted to relay. Tell him not to forget his charger. Seventh contact with Brian. Officer Robbins returns to Brian and tells him that he had a hotel room for him that night. It's a motel, but okay, a hotel room for him tonight. Brian is appreciative. Officer Robbins tells Brian that Gabby said she did not intend to hurt him when she was slapping him, so technically speaking, it does not fit the letter of the code, so he's not charging her with a DV assault case. He tells Brian that he's releasing them both, but didn't want them seeing each other for the night. He tells Brian that Gabby agreed to it, and he told Brian to take the opportunity to take some time for themselves tonight. Officer Robbins then tells Brian that Gabby said she loves him and to not forget a cell phone charger. Don't put words in people's mouths. Officer Robbins asks Brian to not have any communication with Gabby tonight, then says to try and not have contact with each other tonight. Sixth contact with Gabby. He then asked Brian to stand by at the park ranger's truck as he was going to walk Gabby over to the van. Officer returns to Gabby and tells her to not communicate with Brian tonight unless there is earth-shattering emergency news. He said Brian is going to the hotel and he gives Gabby the keys to the van. Gabby asks if it was going to be a far drive for her to get him in the morning. Officer tells her that he isn't going to say where he's going, and Gabby said that was fine. Gabby was just concerned as she doesn't usually drive the van and she wanted to make sure it wasn't too far. The officer is walking Gabby over to the van and stops her and tells her where she can go and get a list of places to go shower if she's looking for a place to do that. He wishes Gabby well, reminds her to not communicate with Brian tonight, and leaves Gabby with the van. Eighth contact with Brian. He returns to Brian and tells him to go ahead and jump in the back seat of his vehicle. Officer Robbins thanks the park rangers for the help. He gets in the vehicle and lets dispatch know he's taking the mail to the Bowen Hotel. He tells Brian that it was his request, but is not legally required to hold to it, that he asked him not to communicate tonight. He then has a conversation and talking about his own wife and her anxiety and what helps her, and tried to help Gabby with some suggestions. Talked about his wife being on medication and stated that within a week his wife was considerably different and made her quality of life better. He asked how long Brian and Gabby have been together. Brian stated they've known each other since high school, but said they've been together for 3 years. Not sure I heard him say 3, but I didn't know the rest. The car ride, they have small talk. Talking about driving, places they've been. Brian brings up Appalachian Trail. Brian said they were going to be heading to Oregon to visit one of her family members or friends. Well, which one is it, Brian? Brian asks about national parks to visit, where they talk about multiple parks in California. Drops him off. 911 audio and radio traffic notes. 911 audio. Reporting party wants to report a domestic dispute. The dispatcher asks what they were doing, and the caller says, "We drove by and the gentleman was slapping the girl." He said they stopped and the two ran up and down the sidewalk, where he proceeded to hit her, hopped in the car, and they drove off. The caller describes the vehicle with the license plate. The dispatcher asks for his name, which he states is. Dispatch asks for his phone number, which is. Dispatch confirms the direction of travel. Radio traffic audio. The dispatcher beeps the tone and alerts law enforcement about a male hitting a female and then leaving the area of the Moonflower and heading north on Main Street, and provides the vehicle description. 2T8, Officer Pratt, asks for the phone number of the reporting party, which is relayed back to the officer. An officer, unknown, Unk, I'm just going to say Unk, states they spoke to another witness who stated there was a full-size backpack attached to the rear of the vehicle as well. 2T8, Officer Pratt states he is clear the Moonflower and looking for the vehicle. 2T9, Officer Robbins asked dispatch to run both occupants, both returning with dispatch, not ever able to find driver license information. Info on the female was incorrect as far as name spelling. Sure was. Okay, so now we'll stop it there for now, and then we'll continue here next time on officer interview notes. Okay, I hope that you enjoyed today's episode. It was just slightly over an hour. I'm going to chunk it down like this. You can see it takes for freaking ever to work through this document, but as you know, it's how I roll. I cannot just summarize this. I've seen almost every other content creator talking about this. Summarize it. In one way, I'm envious. In another, I'm not, because this is how I roll. I can't help it. I don't know how to summarize it. I have to go, meaning, I don't want to skip a detail. I don't want to miss a beat. And you know, on this channel, we deep dive. I can't help it. We're going to go through this piece by piece, word by word, line by line. So I chunk it. Okay, I'm busy with other cases, as you know. And I'll release these as I record them here and there so that you can have time to actually watch it and work through this and pause and think and let me know what your comments are, because I always love hearing the Grizzly intelligent comments. It's amazing. And I love how when someone who isn't quite a Grizzly and leaves some kind of comment that isn't of our standard, that all you Grizzlies go there and start replying to that person. I freaking love it. So thank you so much. If you like this video, please give it a big thumbs up. And if you appreciate all this effort, then I would recommend saying thank you either on PayPal, link below, or buymeacoffee.com/Gisela K, link below. Remember, I only have one tier. By the end of January, there's going to be one tier here on YouTube for $1.99. Okay, that's where we do members only live streams. That's where I upload videos here and there. That's where you get emojis and stickers and members only polls and things like that. Okay. All the other cool perks are on Patreon. So head over there if you want photos, random photos. Today I showed a gallery of photos of a safari that I did in South Africa, which is where I'm from. Safari photos, watercolor art, scripts, videos that are exclusive to Patreon members. So if you want all those cool perks, Patreon is the way. And again, link below. Okay, so thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.